Hello everybody, welcome to this supply management webinar in partnership with GEP. My name is Jennifer Jackson and I'm the contributing editor of Supply Management Insider, and I'm going to be hosting this discussion today. So the topic of our discussion today is supplier diversity, why you need it and how to achieve it. I am joined by an amazing panel of experts today. We've got Natalie Henfrey, who's the Director of Consulting at GEP. Hi, Natalie. We've got James Lloyd, Procurement Director at the CBRE, and David Latton, Head of Global Indirect Procurement and Supplier Diversity and Equality at Logitech. I'm afraid you may have been expecting also Farida Gibbs, the founder and CEO of Gibbs Hybrid. Unfortunately, she isn't able to join us today due to a family emergency. Well, welcome all. I'm sure our audience can't wait to hear your advice on establishing a supplier diversity programme, and also looking forward to hearing your best practice advice in action. Just a note for our audience, so for those of you who are joining us live, you can submit questions and comments for our panel at any point during the webinar, and we'll try and pick up as many of your questions as we can in the time that we've got towards the end of the session. We also have a poll question for you, so you should see it below the video screen that you're looking at now. And the question is, does your organisation have a supplier diversity strategy in place? So we just want to know if yes, you've got a fully developed and operational strategy, or yes, but it's still a work in progress, or not yet, but you've started the process, or no, it just doesn't know, or it doesn't even apply. And also please feel free to comment your answer in the comments box too. We'll be looking at the responses shortly during our discussion. So let's get started on our discussion. Now, most people are familiar with the importance of workplace diversity, that organisations should provide equal employment opportunities for all, and that's regardless of gender, race, disability or sexuality. But perhaps you're less familiar with supplier diversity. So what does supplier demographic diversity mean to you or your organisation? David, can I come to you first on that?
Thanks, Jennifer. Great to be here today. I think broadly speaking, I'd agree with that statement. I think it is less familiar to companies across the globe. Supplier diversity is very well understood in the United States. It's been very well understood there for quite a while, but it's still developing across the globe. What does supplier diversity mean to us at Logitech? I think firstly and most importantly, it's a reflection of one of our core values. One of our core values is equality. We need to make sure there's equality of opportunity across the globe for everyone. It's also a reflection that we know that there's talent across the globe. We want to make sure our suppliers reflect the communities that we serve as a company. We also are very much aware that a more diverse supply base is a more innovative supply base that will help us become a better performing company. So there's some of our underlying ambitions, and we have really ambitious global goals. It's easier to start in the US. There's lots of support systems there, advocacy groups. It's established, as I said, but this needs to be global. It can't just be a US solution. It has to be a global solution. And I think to reach those ambitious goals, we're fundamentally trying to do three things. It's firstly, collaborate with diverse suppliers. In other words, work with those diverse suppliers, get those diverse suppliers doing great things for us as a supplier of ours. Secondly, we look to grow our relationships with diverse suppliers. That could be via sort of networking events where we want to just break down the barriers that have stopped us historically meeting some of these suppliers. It could be learning together, that we do development events to help us learn as a company how to work with these diverse suppliers. We try and in return for that help build the capabilities of some of these diverse suppliers. And then I think lastly, and potentially perhaps even the most impactful area, is that we look to amplify our impact by advocating for other large organizations to do the same, that there's such an impact that large organizations can have towards equality and supply diversity, that the third pillar of our program is to really amplify our impact with those large suppliers as well.
Great, thanks, David. James, what do you think?
I think I would echo a lot of the comments that David's made in terms of the maturity of supply diversity in different parts of the globe, and the fact that there's certain areas that live further down the track than others. And so I've got a greater level of understanding and therefore a greater support structure and maturity to the sector to be able to help and support these programs. In CBRE, again, similar to Logitech in terms of the way we approach it and try and make sure that we are driving the right outcomes for the different stakeholders that are part of our network. That's really, really important. You know, we recognise that different underrepresented groups that you mentioned in the overview, the question, Jennifer. There are in the UK context and globally a high number of different ethnic groups that are underrepresented if you look at the statistics of that business ownership structure versus the overall demographics and populations. The same with the number of women-owned businesses and different areas of disability or sexual orientation. I think those business ownership structures all have the potential to deliver tremendous diversity of thought and create tremendous innovation in the businesses that we're all operating, but we're not unlocking all of that without having a more proactive structure in terms of programs such as this. And until you actually try and create this structure, at least to my mind, there will always be hidden barriers that stop these businesses coming through, and there will be tremendous talent and tremendous opportunity in the supply chain which you're not unlocking. And so that's a really big driver for us at CBRE. And I think we recognise, therefore, that there are both social outcomes and commercial outcomes that can come through this, and it really, really sort of hits the sweet spot when you're able to marry those two together, when you create both social and commercial impact in the same breath.
Great, thank you, James. Natalie, do you have anything to add to that from GEP's perspective or your own perspective?
Yeah, for us, it's about how we leverage our spending power to support disadvantaged communities and create social value, and to really stimulate innovation, as David and James have both mentioned. All of these values, they are very dear to GEP's culture. We are actually a minority-owned organisation ourselves. We have a great culture of respect and equality in the organisation. We talk a lot about growing a beautiful company, and so these supplier diversity really reflects how we operate as a business. We foster these kind of values to help ourselves and also for our clients to grow. Obviously, we are a business services provider, and we are finding that this supplier diversity is becoming more and more important to our client base. It's an area we are doing a lot of work and support for various businesses in, and yeah, it's really rising up the agenda at the moment, and it's great to see that.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Now, some of the barriers to implementing a supplier diversity programme include things like an inability to determine the right parameters for success, not knowing the best performance benchmarks. Some of the questions procurement teams are saying they need the answers to are things like, how do I even begin? How can I select these diverse suppliers? You know, there might be the intention, but how do you actually go about it? And how do you measure the success? Who should you actually benchmark yourselves against? So why is supplier demographic diversity still a challenge, do you think? And what can be done to make it happen? James, what do you think then?
Well, I think you're right. I think there is, as we said earlier, pockets where there's a greater level of maturity in areas that need more support. I think on that key question, however, of how do you get started, the key for me is breaking this down into more bite-sized pieces, not trying to think too far ahead in some respects. I think one of the things that becomes really, really clear to us, the more conversations that we have with our diverse supply partners, is that if you can actually start to move the needle by just engaging and opening the door and reaching out to those that are immediately in your either your immediate network or indeed working with different advocacy groups across the globe or in your country that you're buying for, there are some tremendously positive conversations that you can have there, and you can start with some really, really well thought out, developed dialogue that can start to unlock supply chain opportunities and develop some really nice nuggets and case studies of success where you find some really entrepreneurial businesses within your network. So we work with advocacy organisations in the UK, for example. We work with MSD UK, which is a big network of corporates. There are about 120 corporates and a network of a few thousand ethnic minority-owned businesses in the UK. We work with We Connect International to try and support our women-owned businesses out Britain for LGBTQ plus organisation, Disability In for disabled organisations. And those different networks of specialists in terms of trying to unlock the talent in those supply chains. And by starting off those conversations and just trying to get the dialogue flowing and include those suppliers in RFPs and tender opportunities, there'll be stuff that doesn't go to RFP, which might even be more bite-sized and suitable for their particular scale and scope at that stage of their development. I think you start to get the dialogue flowing and you start to move the needle to understand what those case studies can bring. And once you've found some really, really powerful examples of where value can be created, they are tremendously impactful conversations then to take back internally and actually use as a way of celebrating that success. And we've got some tremendous examples that we've seen, in particular during periods of disruption. So during the COVID pandemic, for example, we had a tremendous set of exchanges with diverse suppliers when we, like many organisations, were desperately trying to get our hands on PPE and sanitizer and all the things that we all needed as a society. There was some really, really innovative suppliers that pivoted and came up with strategies and solutions that delivered products to us in a far more timely way than some of the bigger corporate businesses in our supply chain. And I think when you can create those little nuggets that show the speed to market and the innovation and the creativity, that really helps reinforce the overall programme. So no doubt we'll come to some of those bigger conversations around programme and metrics and systems and platforms, all that stuff. But what I would encourage those on this call to do to start off with, if you're not at that stage, is just try and work hard to understand where you can unlock those conversations and then use those lived experiences to then feed the conversation internally and really, really drive it forward from there.
Great, thank you, James. David, why do you think supplier demographic diversity is still a challenge, and what do you think can be done to make it happen?
I think I'd echo a lot of what James just said, Jennifer. I think that's absolutely right. What we did at Logitech to start really was bite-sized ideas is a really good way to start, I think. And we looked at things like, do you have spend in certain geos? If so, then there's something you can do there. You've got some spend you can do something with. You've most likely got procurement expertise in that area if you've got spend there. And then I think the final piece is about, can you find the diverse suppliers? And the advocacy groups are really helpful for that. That if you've got spend and you've got the will to drive the diversity of that spend and you're working with advocacy groups, you will find diverse suppliers. That's a really great place to start. The first challenges you really encounter, and this is again our Logitech story, but I think it's not unique. The first and biggest challenges, frankly, are internal ones. I think you have to remove bias in your procurement decision-making process. And that started with me individually, really. I think that a number of years ago, if I was talking to our internal teams, I'd have said a whole raft of things around procurement 1.0 kind of best practice would be consolidate everything possible, look at global established players, blue chip references, etc., etc. That will not get you there with supply diversity. What it will achieve, perhaps, is it will mitigate risk. It debatably might give you a cost win, but what it definitely won't do is find you diversity in your supply base. I think to achieve that, you've got to think about things differently. You've got to look at partnerships differently, split up some of the deals that James was talking about. Can regional or national partners do this for you better across the globe rather than one global partner? And then I think for some of that to really get traction internally, you've really got to address the why. Why is this important? Why is having a diverse supply base important? It's important because it actually makes innovative sense for the company. You'll be a better company because you're doing it. It's also the right thing to do, of course. But I think you need that leadership buy-in. You need them to really become allies of it. We have that at Logitech, and we're very lucky to have that. But if you don't have that, then it becomes really difficult to action that change, I think. So get that leadership buy-in. And going back to my point around different ways of thinking, ultimately it means leadership have to be quite explicit about, we are encouraging you to look at things differently. We are encouraging you to look for regional partners, national partners. We're also encouraging you to accept a certain level of risk. Try something new, try some new partners here. If you don't do that, you'll never get the diverse suppliers. But if you do that, I think that's when you really start to address the myth. And this is where it gets really important for Logitech. There's this myth that there aren't diverse suppliers in certain categories, that there are certain strategic areas that you just have to work with the established players. And really, it's nonsense. I think if you put in place the real important foundations of a program and you really want to do it, there are diverse suppliers. It's just whether your organization really wants to put that hard work in to find those diverse suppliers and most importantly, to give them a chance. That's some of the things we try and achieve. And, we're on a journey too, but by no means have we achieved all of that. In terms of measuring success, like James said, we have metrics, everything boils down to metrics, and it's important. And we measure spend with diverse suppliers. We record number of diverse suppliers in our supply base. That's really important, but it can also lead you down the wrong path sometimes. And what I mean by that is we really look at it from a philosophical standpoint. Like I said, there's that myth that you can't get certain diverse suppliers in certain categories. We don't believe that. We believe that there are great diverse suppliers that can be doing the most strategic work for us. And that will ultimately be the mark of success. That will break some of these biases. It will break some of these long-established sort of mistruths about there aren't diverse options. That's separate to spend. It's more about, oh, wow, this is a really important supplier that's diverse. That, I think, is really when we're starting to break down ultimately what we're trying to do with it. So it starts internally, really, frankly, with the multinational is ultimately what I'm saying.
Thank you, David. Natalie, any final thoughts there on why supplier demographic diversity is still a challenge, and what do you think can be done to make it happen?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we have at the moment is there's less focus on it, and it's less emotive than environmental issues. I mean, there's a lot of upcoming legislation happening, particularly in Europe, which are focused on the environment part of ESG, with things like the new European directive, etc. So a lot of procurement organisations I talk to are very focused on that aspect, and nobody's got too many resources right now either. So it's actually how you can allocate your resources best. And in some organisations, they're struggling to find time to invest in supply diversity. I mean, it's important, as David and James have both said, to recognise the benefits you get from these programs, for example, like innovation. And what we typically see in our clients who go down this road, whether they are working with tier 1 diverse suppliers or tier 2, is that they actually exceed the benefits that they set targets for at the outset of their program, typically by 20%. Sometimes it's even higher than that as well. In terms of getting started, I think all of the internal stakeholder buy-in is crucially important, but then taking a very structured approach as to how you achieve this. So assess where you are. First of all, work out, what does diversity mean to your organisation? It may even be different by region globally. And look at who your diverse suppliers are already. So I've spoken to some organisations who've gone on this journey, and actually when they've run their suppliers through the criteria they set, they find out they've actually got a decent sized diverse supplier base already. Look at your future state vision and look at your procurement infrastructure. What can you do to support it? Do you need to change or refocus anyone's individual roles to support this programme? Develop your strategy and your roadmap. Look at where you're going. Don't try and do it all at once. Target specific geographies or specific categories so you can make it manageable, and come up these case studies that James mentioned as well. And then go into execution phase. Start to unlock the operational work. Identify which suppliers you're going to onboard onto the programme, and then you can start to move into kind of a monitoring and measuring kind of phase, and keep adding suppliers into that programme as well.
Jennifer, if I just come in and just add a little bit more.
Sure, yeah.
I think what we're focusing on the conversation that we just had is very much around what are our internal barriers and challenges, and how do we overcome them. And I think the other really important aspects that those on the call need to try and consider when they're going through these conversations is, what are the challenges in the context of the diverse supplier? And I think the vast majority of evidence shows us that the number of diverse suppliers that that we define in the corporate world are SMEs and relatively smaller organisations, and they are not necessarily the most heavily resourced organisations all the time, but have some tremendously entrepreneurial and innovative ways to approach business problems. And in order to actually be able to leverage the most out of what they can offer, we have to make sure that the big, challenging, sometimes burdensome supplier onboarding processes and the structures that we put in place to deliver our overall procurement platform and de-risk the organisations that we're all part of from a corporate point of view are right sized for that supply diversity programme. So making sure that we can onboard those suppliers in a reasonably efficient way, understanding that cash flow is really important to those businesses, and we can make sure that that's in the right place so that they don't have payment delays, in particular for that first invoice that comes in, are all really important, very pragmatic things that need to be done to help those diverse suppliers to our mind. And I think the other thing which sits alongside that is making sure that we as the procurement stakeholders in the overall network within CBRE are able to help our suppliers understand who to connect with internally, because what we don't want to be is the people who are trying to knit together every single conversation and deal in supply chain. There's a huge amount of intellectual knowledge in the business that we need to be able to connect our suppliers with to make sure that we're having really, really valuable conversations. And I think as a ethnic minority-owned business or a women-owned business that hasn't necessarily had a huge amount of exposure to CBRE in the past, I think helping people understand who to connect with internally and how to drive the value in the conversations becomes really, really important.
Thanks, James. Thank you all for your practical tips there. So we're just going to have a look at our poll results. The question that we asked you, our audience, is: does your organisation have a supplier diversity strategy in place? Only 10% of you have said we have a fully developed and operational strategy. 38% though said yes, but it's still a work in progress, understandably. And 29% said not yet, but we have started the process. 22% though said no, or it doesn't apply. Is that shocking to anybody? Natalie, what do you think? Are you shocked by this? Or?
I'm not by the results. I was actually in a one of my clients' supplier networking events last week, where they did exactly the same poll and got very similar results. So I'm not shocked by it. I think it's sad that organisations aren't starting to think of this. I hope that because people are on this webinar, it means they are starting to think about it, and they soon won't be in that last category.
Yeah, nearly 1 in 4 said no.
Yeah, I think I find those numbers quite surprising. I would say, Jennifer, that there is a lot of companies that don't have a strategy, but it may be driven by one final point that came to my mind listening to James speaking at the end of the last section. That I forgot to mention a key thing that we learned at Logitech was executive alignment is great. Challenging your internal biases and ways of working is great. Having targets and even a strategy is great, but you won't move the dial until you resource the program, and that's certainly our lesson when we resourced our supply diversity program. We have one person whose entire role is specifically about driving supplier diversity. That really did put rocket fuel onto it, and I think not only did that sort of make our strategy official, more importantly than having an official strategy, that person actually then made sure we followed through with the strategy. So I think having a strategy is really important from a North Star kind of standpoint, but one point I forgot in the earlier section was get a strategy, that's fantastic, but to actually follow through with it, you need to resource the program. And that doesn't mean someone who's kind of additional 20% on top of their 100% is supplier diversity. The lesson we've learned is that it means someone is exclusively day in, day out looking to drive this, and that's how you'll actually achieve the strategy. But we all need a strategy, hopefully.
Yeah, sure. James?
Well, I think, point one is I'm enormously encouraged by the fact that so many people are here on the call. That says that there is a recognition that this is a really, if nothing else, a really interesting conversation that people want to be part of. Now, how these participants can then move on and actually progress it comes back to those points that that David and Natalie were making in terms of that value proposition and how we can make sure that the stakeholders within that and the leadership group within that business can actually sort of understand the business case and recognise that this is something that they want to be part of. Now, I think history has shown us from all the way since the US Supply Diversity Programme started in the 1960s and 70s through to where we are now, that there is an increasing volume of companies that are really, really seeing the value in this, really, really taking it seriously. At MSD UK, the Ethnic Minority Change Advocacy Network that I mentioned earlier on, I joined MSD UK about 6 years ago, and at that point, the number of corporate members that MSD UK had was about 35. And this November, it's about 135. So I think that shows you the volume growth and the seriousness within which the overall business community is taking this and the value that they see in it. And I think the more you can then come back into my first point around creating those nuggets and those business cases, use those to be able to support the resulting conversation that David mentioned, so that you've got the right support in place, then the more you can drive your program. So yeah, I think I'm really, really enthused that there's so many people involved and engaged today, and I sincerely hope that people find this helpful to be able to move the needle in their particular context.
Excellent. Thank you, James. So quite encouraging, a little bit of surprise at how many haven't started the journey, but hopefully by watching this, a few more will be. Natalie, I just want to come back to you. Interested to hear from you on, is it possible to have complete visibility across your supply chain? How do you actually assess how seriously your suppliers are taking diversity issues, and how vigorously should we interrogate the diversity credentials of those suppliers?
I'm not sure it's ever possible to have visibility across your entire supply chain. I think there's a statistic that says if you map out your top 100 suppliers, you end up with 300,000 at tier N. So it's not really manageable to have that kind of level of visibility in your supply chain. I think by targeting your suppliers where it's possible for them to have a program in place and include it in your general supplier management development program, so it becomes the norm over a period of time, then you can actually start to interact with your suppliers about what kind of programs they're running and how their supply base actually looks. And yeah, I think it should be vigorously interrogated, for want of a better word. And it's really important, not just so people are honest about this kind of thing, but also because from a brand and a commercial point of view, consumers are not stupid. They recognise what greenwashing is, and I think if you're an organisation who's just paying lip service to this, that's kind of a crazy path to go on. And to be fair, a lot of companies we work with are taking that element of it, of actually checking they've got a robust way of measuring their supply base very seriously, to the extent where they're using external auditors to check the credentials in that supply base as well, which is a big investment for them.
Thank you, Natalie.
I think Jennifer, if I could add just one other thing on that. I think one of the key things being able to unlock that visibility through the supply chain is making sure you've got the right structure in place for your tier 2 reporting as well. I think that's one thing, depending on the maturity of your supply diversity program, that really, really helps, is when you've got outsourced operations in particular, and you don't have the same visibility of your immediate diversity makeup, getting a really, really strategic conversation going with your outsourced partner and helping them understand how they can contribute towards your supply diversity program and lots of value by identifying and drilling down into their own spend data becomes a really, really powerful way of both the immediate tier 1 supplier being able to demonstrate and add and create value in the conversation, and for you as the client to be able to drive that conversation further down the supply chain. So I think, to me, that's a really important point of getting that visibility further down the track.
Great, thank you, James. Now, diverse demographics are increasingly having significant market influence. So will organisations that ignore diversity issues and concentrate on core markets really get left behind? Natalie, what do you think?
I think it's a really interesting question at the moment. I mean, there is some research from, I think it's from Forbes earlier this year, said that 56% of consumers were willing to pay more for goods from a brand who delivered on social value like Supplier Diversity. However, we are living in inflationary times, and I think maybe the impact of not doing it is tempered by the fact that maybe less and less people are able to pay more for those kind of brands who deliver on social value right now. But I think in the longer term, yes, it will have an impact, and it's a very important one for consumer perception. And like I said earlier, consumers aren't stupid; they have long memories, and consumer loyalty is a very fragile thing.
Yeah. And James, would you agree with that, or do you have another perspective?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Those companies that don't, by and large, those companies that don't have a strategy for how they're going to create more inclusive processes and create more diversity in their supply chain will increasingly see that the innovation and the creativity that supply chain partners can bring are conversations that they are becoming second to the party on. And their competitors, who may be one step ahead of them in terms of finding diverse supply partners and creating more innovative solutions and have more creative conversations, are having more of a differentiator than they are in their particular industry or sector. And I think we know, the cyclicality of different industries, and if you have got a product or a service where you have got a differentiator on that upcycle, when the market is picking up, that you're going to be able to grow your revenues and your margins much greater when you are at the front of the queue with your differentiators, and you've got greater value to add. So I think, they will increasingly find that they are not able to differentiate themselves as much, and I think that becomes more of a competitive disadvantage.
Okay. Thank you, James. Now, many consumers expect the organisations they purchase from or interact with to reflect their values as well. Are organisations that don't take ethical procurement seriously in danger of cutting into their profits or losing customer loyalty, as you were mentioning earlier, or losing and failing to attract the best talent even? Or is this actually an overplayed concern? David, what do you think?
I think long term, it's absolutely true to say that there is a risk to company revenues and certainly to attracting the best talent if you're not seen as an ally of these causes. But it's not just a long-term topic. There is the challenging economic climate right now, but it still makes absolutely no sense in the short term to not be taking this seriously. There's so much study out there now. Even it makes just good business sense, good financial performance sense to be a diverse team. I think there was a McKinsey study I read recently that if you've got more than 30% of your executive team are women, you significantly outperform another executive team that might have 10 to 30% of their team being women, who in turn actually outperform teams that have even less. So it makes absolute sense in the short term. But I think going back to the long term, I don't want to give the idea that this long term is, out there on the horizon. I think it's pretty much arriving now. And in fairness, I think the Gen Zs and the millennial generation have a lot to thank for it, that they really are entering the economy. Millennials are now entering management and employees, and they are driving real change. I think it's that they want to work and buy from companies of purpose, like you said. They're looking to buy from companies that are good for people and planet. And they're bringing about change. And if you look at the sort of current climate we have now, the economics are tough, that there's lots of global insecurity. We've probably had the worst sort of global environment of threats and insecurities since the 1960s nearly. But I think in fairness to them, there's a generation coming through that are looking to make that big social change that happened back in the 60s too. So it is happening. The long term, if you're a laggard on this, the long term is getting ever and ever closer. I think we're really there. You're starting to see it with the environmental movement, that there is a huge amount of skepticism, and frankly, people are getting very good at assessing whether a company is greenwashing here. On gender, I think there's a similar, people are getting very wise to any pink washing or other diversity washing too. So I think the long term is nearly here, and being diverse, inclusive, equality focused, it is going to become a full commercial reality very soon. So if boards aren't thinking about this yet, then they certainly need to, because that long-term future is getting closer and closer every day.
Thanks, David. What do you think, James? Do you agree?
Wholeheartedly. I think that was very eloquently put. Nothing to add, David. Spot on.
Natalie, anything from you there, or does that sum it up?
Yeah, no, I think it's summed up really well. I mean, it's a huge number of people. It's something like 83% of millennials in particular want to work for an organisation that reflects their own personal brand values. And so it is really important to attracting talent in your workforce is actually getting this right. One of the challenges, though, is that which is kind of related to this. In procurement teams, we're not always that good at attracting talent who understands these kind of issues across the broader ESG spectrum, in fact. And we're finding out that some of the people joining the procurement organisation who may be younger, maybe it's that 83% are very interested in it, but lack the kind of procurement and supply chain expertise to enact it. So as procurement leaders, we need to just make sure that we are bringing in the right talent, but also we're using people who come into the organisation and really understand this to educate people who may be more experienced within our team.
Do you know, actually, Natalie, that's a really good point that you make there. And I was actually going to make a similar point, but coming from a different angle. And talent is key here, as you say. I've actually had a different experience that where I found a talent challenge isn't, as you were saying, the sort of really motivated on these value issues, Gen Zs and millennials coming in, but they need to learn the kind of practitioner angle of procurement. I've actually experienced it from the other side, which is procurement now has shifted so much from where it was even 5-10 years ago, that those practical skills are still really important. You still need to be able to run a decent tender, RFP, negotiate, etc. But I think you have to be so abundantly clear on the why. Nowadays, why am I doing this? Is it business value? Is it innovation? Is it for the ESG related causes? And I think where I found a challenge for talent is combining those two skills, as you said. But I've actually had more experience with really good experienced practitioners, but they're really having to get their head around the world has changed. I'm not just here to run really good RFPs and get savings. I have to think about things a lot more widely. But that's what I've experienced more. But I think absolutely it's true that the real talent of the future in procurement needs to be looking at that bigger, broader picture, values-based. But to actually make that impact, you then need the practitioner skills, as you rightly say. But I've actually seen it more from trying to teach the experienced, real hard negotiating, great procurement professionals to try and get them to see the sort of broader picture is what I've actually had to do more with some of my interactions in the past.
Thanks for that, David. So how can you actually influence or encourage diversity outside your organisation and across the rest of your supply chain? Natalie, what are your top tips there?
I think it's around engaging with the right suppliers who share your values and then making sure that you shout about it. We're all used to having classic kind of supplier segmentations, who's strategic, all of those things on a classic 4-box matrix. What we should be starting to do now is to look at making that more values based and assessing which of our suppliers share our values, who do we need to share our values, and doing some strategic supplier management to make that happen, and also share our expectations that what we want them to do is to actually spread the message and mirror what we're trying to accomplish within their own supply bases.
Thank you, Natalie. And James?
I think there's a couple of things that are really important to this in the context of CBRE. I think one of them is making sure that you are becoming publicly accountable. And if you are, to David's point around various types of washing, I think we need to make sure that if we are espousing the benefits of these programs, we're also able to put ourselves out there and be open with what we're trying to do. So I think we've got a really ambitious goal of spending $3 billion with diverse suppliers by the end of 2025. Our year one goal was $1 billion. Which we hit about 1.2, so that was really, really encouraging, a really positive start. And we've got really, really open, transparent reporting with the metrics that we're using to drive that available for public proves it if people want to look at it. So I think if you want to try and create an external ripple and make sure that you are putting yourself out there, then I think that's one of the key first steps. And we went through that change a few years ago to be able to make sure that we can publicly report. And that was a really big shift for us. And I think that really gives a huge amount of confidence, and to David's point around the whys and trying to generate a focal point for the organisation so that we understand how we're coming together. That sort of reporting becomes really, really important because it sets our overall vision into a clear context. And I think the other piece out there is to make yourself really, really open to interactions with all sorts of different networks, be it this session that we're having today, or leveraging off all the different advocacy groups. For example, at CBRE, we by signing up for MSC UK, the organisation I mentioned earlier on, we are able to put ourselves forward to sit on the board that steers the organisation of that non-profit group, and we sit alongside a number of other corporates that do that. So it means the benefits of sharing with other organisations, such as in our case, we speak to the likes of Unilever and Meta and IBM and Agile One, lots of other really interesting organisations out there which aren't necessarily in our sector. We can spread that knowledge and interact across different industries and get very different perspectives on how we're solving these problems. And I think that's really, really powerful. And the networks that add the most value are those ones that stimulate those really, really good conversations around benchmarking and how you are overcoming challenges. And there's some great breakout forums and groups that you can get involved with and just put yourself forward to. And I think finally, I would say, and probably this is just maybe a CBRE thing or a cultural thing, but we, as a bunch of colleagues, we also get quite competitive, and so trying to gamify and understand what makes people tick is another part of it. So we will regularly put ourselves up for awards if we feel that that's the right thing to do, and try and put our best foot forward for that. And I think all those sorts of things that help galvanise and lift the team in terms of those motivation are really, really nice ways of trying to drive it. And by doing that, you make yourself publicly accountable and a little bit vulnerable as you go through that process. So I think all of that is great stuff. And that also gives you some great things to talk about within those in your supply chain as well.
Fantastic. Good stuff. Thanks, James. And David, any final thoughts there from you on how you can influence or encourage diversity outside your organisation and across the rest of your supply chain?
Yeah, Jennifer, I think this question is absolutely crucial, and I'd agree with everything said so far. When we thought about this at Logitech, we really sort of looked at it through the lens of equality is a core value at Logitech. We're looking to drive equality in our supply base. Traditional supplier diversity is one way of doing that, but a challenge from Bracken Durrell, our CEO, directly to us was, while supplier diversity is amazing, all of our suppliers in an ideal world would share our values, would look to progress those values, would be an ally for equality as well. Supply diversity on its own can't achieve that. This is not up to the diverse suppliers to achieve this or to solve this. We've got really ambitious goals around our diverse suppliers, but we're always going to spend a lot with a lot of other large companies. What can we do as a large company? What can we do to inspire and challenge other large companies to move on this? Those large companies have millions of employees across the globe, trillions of dollars of revenue. Large companies can make huge impacts towards equality and other challenges for society if we can inspire each other to do that. We need these companies to be ambitious on equality and diversity due to that huge potential impact they can have. And I think, talking supplier diversity language, the traditional answer to that is tier 2 programs. The idea that Logitech go to another large company and say, hey, you're a big supplier of ours. Supplier diversity is really important. How much are you spending with diverse suppliers? We may even put in place some targets around that and some stretch goals around that. That's really great, don't get me wrong, but we also need to get better at challenging each other and inspiring each other. Like James said, how diverse are you potentially as a large company, as a large supplier of ours? If we work with company XYZ that are enormous, how diverse are you yourself? I mean, that's a huge impact. when you look at equality and the idea that we all need to be working towards equality, how diverse and equal focused are these large companies? So that's something that we've thought about at Logitech, and we've actually started assessing some of our highest impact suppliers, some of those really big companies. We've started to assess them according to whether they're living up to the UN Women Empowerment Principles. Do they have really good representation at leadership of women? Do they have good policies and procedures and other angles? That's what we started doing on gender, but I think we can all look at doing it across other angles. But I think to allow myself to dream for a moment, I think where we need to get to is supplier diversity is fantastic, but big companies need to challenge other big companies about the nuts and bolts of what they're doing. Are they fair? Are they equality focused? And if we all start doing that as a matter of course, I think that the impact there could be fantastic. And one thought I often have, I think it was mentioned earlier about the environmental cause and how that takes a lot of the oxygen at the moment. And I understand that. I think it was Natalie that said that. But I often think everyone knows when their company is going to be carbon neutral, net zero, whatever it might be. And I get that. And it's really important that companies know that. If you ask them, okay, well, when are you going to be gender equal? Or when are you going to live up to SDG 10, is it? I think about reduced inequalities. They will not know. The vast majority of companies do not know when they're going to be that aspirational goal of, okay, when are you going to be gender equal or equal towards other minorities? If we can all work towards that idea and make that a thing that all companies start asking each other, it's great you're going to be net zero by date X, Y, Z, but when are you going to be equal towards women, towards other minorities? I think that's what we can actually learn from the environmental cause. And it's big companies inspiring and challenging each other better, I think, like James said. That's where we can really start to make an impact too. It's not just on the diverse suppliers. The big companies need to inspire each other too.
I love that. That's great, David. I think that's a really, really nice summary of what we need to do. And I think just listening to you there, one of the things that springs to mind is probably, again, full circle here, but coming to my first point around just getting started, what helps those conversations is to be able to take the sort of macro conversation down to the micro level. And I think some of the really nice examples that we've seen in CBRE is not only that we're working and discovering what we've found through the likes of Feminist UK, We Connect, Out Britain, etc., but understanding the more tailored conversations that might be within a certain geography and a certain community, and being able to really, really share those opportunities and those experiences. So there's a group called the Saffron Group up in northwest England, do some great work up there. They're not a formal advocacy group, but it's a network of small businesses that have got themselves organised and up and running to be able to support each other in terms of being able to market and position their businesses. There was an inaugural Black Business Entrepreneurs Conference in London earlier this year, and there were a few hundred young Black owned businesses wanting to get off the ground. And these are all very new businesses within each of those new groups, but within each of those groups there's lots of really, really great stuff to learn as a procurement person from those particular communities and the value that they can bring. So when you can bring some of those really micro conversations through to help drive the big macro conversation and stimulate debate between different corporates, I think that makes it so much more real and powerful, and people can then feel it far more.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. It's really been great to hear your experiences and thoughts so far. We've got a little bit of time for some audience questions now. So let's move on to those now. I can see quite a few have been coming in already. Hard to pick one, really, because there are so many. This is quite a nice one. How would you strike a balance between diversity goals and the overall quality assurance objectives? So it's kind of that tricky balance. Who would like to have a look at that one, David?
I can have a first shot at that if you want, Jennifer. And I think it stems from when we first launched this. 2020 was a really big year for us, as it was for a lot of companies, a huge year of disruption, COVID pandemic and the unequal impact of that and all the other reasons. So we really dialed in on what are we actually trying to do with our program here. And we thought about a lot of the underlying principles, some of which I've mentioned already. But one of them was, and this goes for talent as much as it goes for suppliers, we will always work with the best supplier for the particular requirement we have. we will go through every possible avenue possible to try and make that a diverse supplier, a women-owned business, a minority-owned business. But it doesn't do anyone any favors if you don't work with the supplier that's right for that particular need. So I think that ultimately is how we address that issue, that we will work with the best supplier for the requirement we have. We can scope it differently and look at certain countries or maybe carve out pieces of the puzzle, like I say, to increase the chance of finding diverse suppliers. But if the scope of it is too international or too large, or if there isn't quite the right fit, it doesn't do anyone any favors in the long run to go with that wrong supplier. So I think we always find the right supplier for the right project, making every effort that that's a diverse supplier. If it isn't a diverse supplier that wins that particular project, then I think the feedback loop is really important too, that we try and make a particular effort to say, really great proposal, but wasn't quite right because of X, Y, Z. Next time around, if you do this and this, you may have more of a chance. So we try and help that way too. But I think if you always go with the right supplier, you should mitigate that, and you scope it correctly, you should mitigate that. And that's the best way to do it, really. Giving it to a diverse supplier just because they're a diverse supplier is never going to really work out in the long run.
Thanks, David. James, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very individual answer depending on the organisation that you're part of and what your overall goals and objectives are. So it's got to be driven by what's right for you as a business, coming back to all the, whatever it is, the 45 minutes of conversation we've had so far and getting that balance right. You look at public sector contract awards, it might be sort of 10 or 20% award based on different ESG criteria. So maybe that's a broad brush guide for certain businesses. But I think it's got to be focused on what's your driver as a business. And I think the only other thing I'd say is, aside from the balance of the scorecard, the really important thing is to make sure that you've got an understanding of what your enablers are along the breadth of your procurement processes. So don't always get too focused on the scorecard. Make sure you've got the right structure and the enablers, and that you're facilitating the inclusiveness in those supply chain conversations overall.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Natalie, anything to add there? Final thoughts?
Yeah, on what we're seeing in some of our clients who have got these programs in place is actually they go through a robust pre-qualification process to make sure the suppliers can deliver on capacity and quality, and then create preferred supplier lists from diverse suppliers. So they know that they are targeting not just organisations who drive good change in their locality, but also that they can deliver and they can stand up against non-diverse suppliers in a fairly equal way when it comes to competitive processes.
Great, thank you. Let's look at another question that's come through. Do short-term contracts contribute to the diversification of the supply base based on the ever-changing and extremely volatile nature of the supply chain environment? What time span for the supplier-based diversity should be monitored? James?
Well, there's nothing particularly wrong with allocating a contract to a supplier if it's a relatively short-term contract. That's the inference of the question. There happens to be a diverse supplier. It's David's point earlier on. If it's the right fit with the right supplier for the right products and service at the right set of objectives that are being delivered, then terrific. And indeed, it may well be that actually for certain suppliers that might be a great place to start, just having something which is relatively bite-sized and sort of tight in scope for that supplier to be able to come in and prove the value that they can create. And then it's up to the supplier then to blow the socks off it and make sure that everyone's really, really happy. And then they'll get, they'll put themselves in a great position for when the future opportunities come. In terms of the bigger answer of what's our supply diversity program timescale, we've done that over a 5-year timescale in order to hit a $3 billion spend target. So a couple of different ways of answering it there.
I think my only adds to that would be that there's absolutely nothing wrong, of course, with short-term contracts with a diverse supplier or spot buys with diverse suppliers. I think the holy grail of what we're all trying to do here is really grow that diverse spend, grow that impact. It's a lot easier to do that when you have recurring, sustainable spend in big strategic areas. I think that's the holy grail of what we're trying to get to. But absolutely. You know, if there are spot buy opportunities or short-term contract opportunities, we will absolutely do that too. And then I think one other thought that came to me, if I'm taking the question correctly, was, and James kind of said it too, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing a short-term contract. In fact, if we're going to a new supplier, whether they be a really big player or a new diverse option, it's always wise to look at, you know, pilots or a short-term kind of test to see how it goes, and then you can go into a deeper, longer relationship. All those kind of good procurement rules still exist, and there's nothing wrong with that. If that means that your executive is more willing to take a risk on a new supplier, then that's a great thing. Let's do it and give them the chance to blow their socks off, to blow our socks off. I think that's fantastic too. But ultimately, that reoccurring, really great partnership-centered spend is how you start to grow your impact over a long period of time. You can grow it in the short term with spot buys, but it's going to be tiring to keep on trying to recapture that same sort of spot buy year over year. What we need and what those diverse suppliers need is that security of long-term partnership. But to get there, if you need to do some short-term tests, that, you know, that makes absolute business sense to do that, doesn't it? And that's the same with any supplier. So I think they're just thoughts that I had to that question.
And actually, I think, Jennifer, one of the great answers that would come from this would probably be from someone like Frida, who sadly can't be here today, but I think she's got a great story of how she's built Hybrid into a really, really great organisation from starting up a few years ago. And yeah, she will no doubt tell you that it was a long old road, and it started with lots of smaller opportunities that she's had to build up and eventually build that credibility in order to create the tremendous organisation operating across several different divisions in lots of different countries that she's got now. And it's a wonderful case study in being able to develop over time.
Yes, thank you for that, James. And you were mentioning, you know, obviously the purpose of celebrating and showcasing the success that you have. So one question that we've had from the audience is, can you give us some examples of the measures to evidence the success of diversity? So perhaps could you just recap some of those things you mentioned and share any more of those measures to actually evidence the success of diversity?
Yeah, so some of the measures that we were critiqued on when we put ourselves forward for different awards, the amount of spend that we have hit with different diverse suppliers, the volume of suppliers that are now in our supply chain compared to where we were 12 months ago. We are critiqued on our level of engagement with different advocacy groups in the case of going for an award with an advocacy group. So one of the things that becomes really important to those organisations are that not that you sign up to Out Britain, We Connect, MSV UK and say, there we are, I can put that logo up and demonstrate what we're doing, but actually that you are a really, really active participant of those networks, and that you go to meet suppliers and that you listen to what they've got to say, and then you try and help them understand your challenges within the corporate network, and you try and build those relationships and help people appreciate it from the other perspective. And until we actually move the needle by getting far more active networks as opposed to just people that are signing up for the membership, we're not necessarily going to be able to make the impact that is out there if we look at all of our supply chain spend holistically. So I think that's a really good example of the metrics and the importance of being able to demonstrate that you're engaging and you're really, really driving some good discussions.
Thank you, James. I'm just going to go to one last question I think we've got time for. It's a kind of a future gazing one. So while the majority of businesses engage in some sustainability practice for their public relations, will the rising cost of operations result in greater commitment towards sustainability? So it's a bit of a prediction thing there. I don't know, David, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, well, I think building on what I said earlier on during our conversation, the moral case for doing the right thing on sustainability and equality is obvious. I think the business case is becoming more and more obvious too, due to a lot of the research that we mentioned about. But I think, frankly put, really, it's a competitive differentiator. Really, I think it comes to the fundamentals of any business is looking to how can they differentiate from other businesses, and sustainability is a really good lever that you can do that now. And of course, the virtuous cycle of it is that it's entirely the right thing to do. We need to be doing it for the planet and for society on the planet too. So I think our CEO was on an event recently, and he was kind of asked this question through a different lens around stakeholder capitalism. And he summed it up as saying, we're getting to a point now that stakeholder capitalism isn't a thing anymore. It's just capitalism. And that's actually a really great place to be, that stakeholder capitalism has become just capitalism. It makes absolute sense. In fact, you can't succeed if you're not doing the right thing for people and planet, as in addition to the last P that everyone knows. I think it's become capitalism. That is long-term successful, sustainable businesses need to be doing that on people and planet as well.
Thanks, David. Natalie, any final thoughts there?
I agree with everything David said. But I think we've also got to keep an eye a little bit on the commercial aspects of it and make sure that we are doing the right thing by the diverse suppliers that we're bringing in, making sure we're doing things like not asking them to do things like overinvest in our contract, particularly if it's one of those short-term ones, making sure we're giving them fair payment terms, because unless we balance off what we're trying to do with some of those commercial aspects, we'll kill the market dead.
Thank you,
that's
Natalie.
a great point, isn't it, Natalie? Sorry, Jennifer, just one other thought came to my mind, that building on what I've just said, I think society is really moving towards that. Stakeholder capitalism is just capitalism now. But I think one thing that all of us can do as allies of those causes is try and be really action focused in our own organizations. But I think there's a temptation there to go down the washing path that we were talking about earlier on. I think all of us need to exercise our professional judgment to really hold people to account that, yeah, that sounds great, David, but what are you actually doing? Or what are Logitech actually doing here? Or what are CBRE doing there? I think we can really hold each other to account, because there is that temptation that society, thankfully, is moving towards this 3P model. And it's actually, I think this feels like it's actually real this time. One thing we can all do is make sure we're holding each other to account to make sure that it is genuine, authentic, and action focused, etc. So I think have your radar of washing always on the outlook for, is this just noise or is it actually making an impact?
Brilliant. And James, any burning answer there before we wrap up? We've just run out of time, but do you have anything to add?
Well, just one other thing, which again, I'm trying to distill this back to really, really practical things that will help move the needle. Feeding off some of the things that David said about making this sustainable, I think to make these programs work and be progressive and reciprocal so that people can make sure there's sustainable value there. One of the things that we need to get better at as a set of procurement professionals, I would argue, is making sure that when those diverse suppliers come for opportunities or gets down selected for an RFP but don't get there, there's a really good feedback mechanism to try and make sure that we as procurement professionals are helping them understand what they need to do in order to actually do better next time. And I think that's just, again, probably a very, very practical takeaway, but something that really, really helps us move to that more sustainable place in time.
Thank you very much, James. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. But thank you to our wonderful panelists again, Natalie, James and David, for taking part in the discussion. And thanks to everyone in our audience for tuning in as well. I hope you've learned lots. And thank you to GEP for partnering with us on this webinar. The recording will be available shortly, so you can come back and watch again in case you missed anything or you want to go back over something in particular. Have a good rest of your day and goodbye for now.